Okay. Welcome to NoVA UX Meetup's September event. My name is Jim Lane. I'm joined this evening by co-organizer Alex Shao. Jody Thomas wasn't able to join us this evening, but sends her best. For those of you who are not familiar with our group, NoVA UX is a meetup for UX professionals in the Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. metro areas, although we have members joining events from elsewhere in the United States and even some friends overseas. So our group has been hosting monthly talks and workshops since NoVA UX was founded in 2012. We are delighted that you all could join us this evening. So before I start tonight's talk, let's take care of a few housekeeping details. This is being recorded to the cloud. It will be uploaded to YouTube. It takes us a little while to give us some time, but these are uploaded to the NoVA UX YouTube channel. And if you go visit the channel, you can see lots of previous talks going back several years. If you have questions this evening for Eva, please post them in the chat channel. Alex will be monitoring, and we're going to be doing a Q&A at the end of Eva's talk. So if you have a question, put it in there. We're going to keep track of all of them, and then we'll circle back and answer as many as we have time. And hello, good to see you. So if you would like to share your thoughts about tonight's event on social media, our Twitter accounts are on the slide in front of you. NoVA UX Meetup is the group's handle. Eva's is ePenzimug. Jody's not here, but hers is Jody with a Y. Alex is @Perfect, and mine is Jim Lane Nova. So please feel free to tweet, post on Facebook, LinkedIn. We have accounts on all the big networks. We're not yet on TikTok, though. We should do that sometime. That'd be kind of fun. So to get us started, tonight's speaker is Eva Penzimug, principal designer at 8th Light, founder of the Inclusive Safety Project, and author of Design for Safety, which is available from A Book Apart. And I'm going to put the link to that book in the chat channel if anybody wants to check it out. Please extend a warm welcome to Eva Penzimug, and we'll go ahead and get started as soon as we switch over the slides. So we're glad you all could join us this evening.
All right, cool. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and start my presentation. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Really excited to present to you all. Cool, okay. Oh gosh, you know what? This isn't supposed to be here, I'm so sorry. I've done this for a couple different groups now. Yes, great, okay. Sorry about that. This is Design for Safety Key Considerations. My name is Eva. I'm the author of Design for Safety and the founder of the Inclusive Safety Project. I'm also principal designer at a software consultancy called 8th Light. My pronouns are she and her. Before we get started, just want to do a quick trigger warning, go over the different contents that might be sensitive for some folks. So domestic violence, child abuse, as well as non-consensual outing. Obviously, you know, we're all remote. Most people have their cameras off. So, you know, I won't even know if you have to step away. Definitely take care of yourself if you feel like you need to do so at any time during this talk. So for the next 45 minutes-ish, I'm going to talk about a very quick overview of what it means to design for safety. The bulk of this will be going over the different key considerations. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to integrate this into your work, and then we will do questions. So like it was said earlier, please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Cool, so designing for safety in a nutshell means doing realistic assessments of how your product facilitates interpersonal harm. So that's things like domestic violence, elder abuse, child abuse, and then preventing it and mitigating it. It also means prioritizing the goals of your most vulnerable users while working against the goals of users who seek to weaponize your product for harm. So this is a little bit different from sort of typical UX, what we're talking about in terms of trying to help all of our users sort of achieve all of their goals. When it comes to designing for safety, it's actually important to identify certain goals and then make sure that people can't do them, or to put up some roadblocks or different things. And that'll make more sense as I get into some examples. And then I do want to have a quick note before I get into the key considerations on something called checkbox frameworks. A checkbox framework is what it sounds like. It's when you just have a sort of list of different things that you need to go through to sort of get at tackling a certain issue. But it's it has some drawbacks because you run the risk of not really learning more about the issue and not really internalizing the different things. So I want to encourage people to just kind of keep that in mind, and to resist what's called action bias, which is where we just want to rush into action before we really understand the problem, that it's okay to sit with some discomfort, and that there are a lot of like really uncomfortable things when it comes to designing for safety. And it's important that we understand them as we're starting to take action on them. I'm not saying you should be an expert on this issue before you take some action, definitely not, but just remember that there is a lot to learn, and that I'm just really encouraging people to sort of think of this as like a continuous learning journey that you're on, and to not sort of just think that you can go through a bunch of checkboxes and be good, because that's just very much an oversimplification. And I say this because what this presentation is going to feel kind of like I'm presenting a checkbox framework. I'm going to go through a bunch of different things that I'm going to tell you to keep in mind. And you might think, like, if I do all those things, then I'll be good. But it is important to sort of build a foundation of knowledge around what this means, which is definitely not possible to do in a 45-minute talk. Okay, so with all that caveat noted, let's get into the key considerations. So I'm going to be telling a couple different stories. They're all true stories that are from either my research or from with actual survivors and of different types of interpersonal harm, or from news articles or academic studies. And I actually want to start with a story that's going to be a little bit different from the rest, because it's about harm that's a little more passive. And there are so many different examples of this, but I want to give just one, because I want people to be able to use the different tools that I'll share later to identify all sorts of harms. And just because it was passive or not really thought about doesn't mean that it still isn't severe. So I want to give a story about that. So this is Victoria. Victoria is a trans woman who recently started a new job at a large tech company. And she's told her boss about her gender identity, and she'll kind of tell her friends as she makes them at work, but it's not something she's gonna just, announce on Slack. So when she fills out a demographic survey as part of her onboarding, she's happy to put down that she identifies as a trans woman. A few weeks later, at a quarterly meeting, the HR team goes over the demographic survey, which they do twice a year to kind of update everyone in the company about where they're at with their demographics. It includes a data point that the company has one person who identifies as trans. Since this is a new data point, since the last time this information was shared, and Victoria is the only new employee, she has essentially been outed. So this is an example of a data harm. And with a lot of these types of harms with data, it's really important to ask ourselves who's in control, and do they have control of their data? So do they have control of their personal data? And how are they informed about how their data is going to be used? Or are they even informed about it? There are many, many ways our data is used that we're not really informed about, or that you have to have sort of advanced knowledge to really understand. And then what happens to a person when they leave a product or a service? Or for example, with Victoria, if she leaves this job, what happens to the data about her gender identity? So these are important things to think about when it comes to data harms and the question of who's in control. Okay, so next we're going to get into some more stories that are more focused on interpersonal harm, which is kind of what I spend all my time thinking about and focusing on. So this first one is about Rob, who is a college senior, and he lives with 3 roommates on a house near their campus. Nathan, his roommate, is really into smart home devices, and he has a bunch of different things that he's set up for them. Smart lights, smart lock, a Nest for the temperature, and he sets up all these things the day that they move in together. Nathan kind of messes with his roommates with the smart home devices, and it's all in good fun. But after he gets into an argument with Rob about dirty dishes, and there's a lot of tension between them, he starts to sort of target Rob more and more. When Rob is trying to cook in the kitchen, Nathan turns off the lights from the other room using his phone. And he does this over and over again. Even when Rob tells him it's not really funny anymore, he keeps doing it. Later on, Rob and Nathan have a disagreement about the temperature. Rob thinks it's sweltering, but Nathan is comfortable and he doesn't want to get cold and have to put on a sweater if he turns down the temperature. The two both use their Nest apps to continuously change the temperature back and forth over the course of a few hours until Nathan finally just removes Rob from the account because he's the account owner and he could do that. He then starts turning the heat up to 90 degrees and says it's a joke. This causes Rob to have to come down from his room and change the temperature manually on the Nest since he can no longer use the app. Finally, he gets fed up and decides he's just gonna go study in the library. When he returns, the key code for the smart lock on the front door doesn't work. He puts it in over and over again, but it just won't unlock. After pounding the door in frustration, Nathan opens the door for him and insists that he's just not using the device correctly. Nathan feels like all of this joking around has morphed into something more sinister, but he's just not really sure how to handle it. So when we think about shared accounts with Internet of Things harm, we need to remember that they enable a whole bunch of different harms, such as surveillance, gaslighting, and tormenting. So when it comes to IoT devices, thinking about, is the survivor able to quickly identify what's happening and how it's happening? And in this case, Rob was. He knew exactly what was going on, but a lot of times, especially in a domestic violence context, people might not share the app. They might not help the other person set up the device. And they might be able to sort of do all this tormenting without the person even really understanding that it's coming from an IoT device. The other things to think about is the survivor able to quickly regain control of a device? If they do own the device and say, it's a former partner who has left the home, but they're able to still torment the person or gaslight them using the device, are they able to understand that's happening and then regain control of it? And then is there some kind of fallback for people who are intentionally excluded? So in the example I just shared, Rob was able to still turn on the lights. He was able to still use the Nest because there were still these sort of other fallbacks, but he wasn't able to get into the house because there was no actual keyhole for a key. So there was no way that he could get in once he was sort of being excluded from this device. And that was has the potential for a lot of harm. Okay. This next story is about Isaac and Helen. They are a recently married couple who have just opened up a shared bank account. The only problem is that while their account is totally shared and they even have separate logins, which is great, the banker who set them up made Isaac the primary user on the account, meaning that it's his information that gets used on the verification quiz that shows up when there are certain issues flagging a security issue. And this can be as simple as just like logging into the account from a new device or a new Wi-Fi network. So things that are pretty common. So this means that whenever Helen logs into the account from a new computer, those identity verification questions that show up are all about Isaac and his identity and his data. And these questions are actually really effective, even with someone like, someone who are married and they've been together for a long time. It'll often have things like which house number goes with an old address. And if the address is from when you were a child or even, in college or whenever before you met, it can be really hard to know what the answer is. You usually have to ask the other person for the answers. So since these questions are all about Isaac's identity, it gives him a lot more power in the relationship. Eventually, Isaac realizes this is a thing and he decides to use that power and cut Helen off from their shared account. He starts withdrawing cash for her to use, and he's essentially giving her an allowance. This type of financial abuse is really, really common in domestic violence contexts. Studies have found that 99% of abusers enact some element of financial control. And shared bank accounts that aren't fully shared and are actually privileging the user somewhere along the line are definitely contributing to this problem. So shared accounts are a source of control all over the place. It's not just with financial products, although that's one where it gets really problematic, but we see this in all sorts of different things. So whenever there's a shared account, it has to be handled really, really carefully. So thinking about, does one user actually have more power? And then If there is a power imbalance, is it transparent or is it opaque? Because maybe there's not actually a way around this issue. I haven't been able to figure out why there has to be ultimately one user in a shared account whose identity gets used for the identity verification questions. But I'm betting it hasn't been changed because there's something like really intense in like a data structure somewhere. It would be, hundreds of hours of work, which, doesn't mean that it's okay that it hasn't been changed. But sometimes it's just not possible, or the person you're trying to convince is just going to say no, like it has to be this way. And in that case, it needs to be transparent that this is happening, because Helen had no idea that this was going on. Whereas if this had been transparent when the banker set up their shared account, she could have understood that this was going to be a problem that she had to deal with, and she could have potentially taken some actions that would have given her more control over her finances. And then the last thing to think about is, does the user with less power have a clear path forward to gaining control over the account? So this often comes into play with a customer service center. So is there an easy way for the person to be able to speak to an actual human being who can understand all of the nuances of these problems? A lot of companies try to save money by not having a very robust customer service team, have a lot of like FAQs or chatbots or different things. But especially when we're thinking about safety issues, there are things that you just need a human being who can understand all the complexities of human beings to be able to talk to in order to regain control of the account. But there has to be something, and this has to be considered. Okay. So this next story is about Owen. He's a 12-year-old boy, overall happy kid, very well adjusted. His parents, like many parents, are very concerned about his safety. And like many parents, they're surveilling him in a couple different ways. It also happens that they're part of a very conservative church, and they want to make sure that their son isn't looking at certain things online that they don't approve of, which is a list that's pretty long and includes a lot of things that are not blocked by traditional child safe filters. So all this surveillance is very well intentioned, but it has some problems. First of all, Owen is growing up knowing that an adult is always watching. And while this wasn't such a big deal when he was younger, now that he's getting into his preteen years, it is becoming a bit of a problem. He's starting to resent the omnipresence of his parents. His mom will do things like call him after school and say, you need to do a better job of putting your shoes and coat away, and you need to get started on your homework. And she is watching him through a camera, so she knows exactly what he's doing. Or if he goes to a friend's house and him and his friend decide to go on a bike ride around the neighborhood, she'll call him and ask why he's left that friend's house. He also recently had a fight about her with the camera in his bedroom. He's becoming more aware of his body, and he doesn't want anyone watching while he gets dressed in the morning. His mom promises that that's not happening, but he regularly puts things in front of the camera to completely block it from view in order to get some privacy, to make the screen completely black. Some level of privacy, we know, is hugely important for the development of older kids and teenagers, and researchers have documented the negative impacts of not being allowed to have space to explore and develop outside of the watchful eyes of parents, which is something that is a really tricky balancing act for a lot of parents to do. The other issue is that Owen doesn't realize that his parents have recently installed monitoring software on his phone. They're able to see everything he does, including search terms that he's been looking up more and more because he's starting to think that he's gay, or he at least doesn't think about girls the same way his friends do. He's not 100% sure. So he's looking at things online to try to help him figure it out. He really wants to know for sure because he knows that his parents will not be happy if he is gay because they're part of a very conservative church. So he's really trying to figure this all out in secret. And this is a very real concern. According to a study by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Policy Institute and the National Coalition for the Homelessness, LGBTQ+ youth experience homelessness at a disproportionate rate. And this often happens when they come out to their parents. Their study found that 50% of gay teens receive a negative reaction from their parents, and 26% are outright kicked out of their homes, which is over a quarter of young people coming out to their parents, and coming out results in homelessness. So considering this reality, preventing LGBTQ+ teens from being secretly monitored is really important. And I'm saying that it's important that they are prevented, that it's prevented from being secretly monitored. I'm not saying that parents shouldn't be monitoring their kids at all. I think it needs to be part of an open conversation. And I also honestly don't think that like preventing all monitoring is a reasonable goal, but I think that we can prevent it from at least being secret, which I'm going to talk a little bit more with this slide. So when we're thinking about surveillance, does the target of surveillance know that they're being surveilled, and have safeguards been put in place to ensure surveillance is not used against non-consenting adults? So with this first point, the issue with Owen is that it was secret, and he had no idea that this was happening. And if he had known, he could have taken steps to do his research in a way that was more safe. This gets into the issue of Stalkerware, which is software that is you're able to install on someone's device completely secretly. They have no idea it's there. There's like no app icon. There's nothing in the UI that would alert them to it. And you basically have to be a forensics expert to even be able to figure out that it's there. This is legal somehow in the US, although there's different groups working on it. And it's really bad because when it's completely secret, it's especially bad in a domestic violence context, especially for people who are leaving a relationship, which is when they are most likely to be murdered by their current or former intimate partner. And 3 women are murdered each day by a current or former intimate partner. So being able to keep your location secret is very important, obviously, in these situations. And also it's important when someone is safety planning their escape, that they're able to not be surveilled secretly, and the person can see that they're making plans to leave. There have been several domestic violence murders linked to Stalkerware, which is something I talk about in my book. If you're interested in learning more about that, this is a really big problem. And I want to just quickly mention that this issue of surveillance shows up in all sorts of sneaky ways. This story had to do with, cameras, as well as installing software on someone's device to monitor them. But there's all these different ways that surveillance shows up. So for example, this is the Amazon Echo, and it has a feature called Dropin, which is another way that domestic violence advocates are reporting this type of surveillance is happening. So for anyone who's not familiar, it's you set it up, you have certain contacts who are allowed to drop in on you. And this means that basically it starts a call. And I think this picture is a little bit older model. I believe the newer ones have cameras in them. So it essentially starts a video call. But unlike a traditional phone call, which you can accept or decline, a drop-in just starts. And this is a way that abusers are able to sort of drop in and secretly listen to their victim, because if the volume is turned down and they don't hear the little alert, or abusers will hide these and do these different things that someone might not even know it's there, they're essentially able to use it as a listening device. So it's not just cameras and Stalkerware and these softwares, it's all these like really sneaky ways that it shows up. So we have to be really vigilant about different ways that people are surveilling each other. Okay, next story is about Erica. She has broken up with her abusive boyfriend, Dan, but suddenly Dan is everywhere she goes. She's put all her social media to private. She's done all the different things on the different online resources in these situations, been looking to make sure that they don't have any of their accounts linked, that she's not sharing her location with him on Google Maps. She's even moved out of her apartment a month early so that she can get to a new place where he doesn't know where she lives. But he still is showing up. She's following all these different guides, and yet a week later, she sees him watching her from his car. Erica's really terrified that he's gonna figure out where she lives. She's losing sleep. Her work is suffering. She's at her wit's end, and she basically just has no idea how he's actually tracking her. So thinking about location data privacy is one of the really big issues with safety. So thinking about, does your product make location data public to certain users? Is it clear to the user when and how their location data is visible to others? Is privacy the default? So these are all really important issues for the 1 in 6 women and 1 in 19 men who are stalked at some point in their lives in the US. It's very common and is often a precursor to physical domestic violence as well as domestic homicide. There is a link between these two things. So making sure that your product isn't making your location data public. And then if it is, that it's like extremely clear how it's happening. And then setting privacy as the default. I've been looking at a lot of different fitness products and fitness apps, and there's often a social element. You can like share with people your like running routes or cycling routes. You can sort of like plan workouts with different people, which is all super cool. But a lot of times there can be issues if these things aren't set to privacy by default. And this was an issue with Strava, which is a fitness app, which is another example that I get a little bit deeper into in my book that had some location data stuff not private by default. And you had to kind of go through, you had to first of all know that this was a thing, and then you had to go through the settings, kind of figure out how to turn it off. The language was not super clear. And that's really problematic because the person hasn't like authentically consented to their data being shared in this way. So that leads us into the next and final story, which gets in a little bit more into this consent issue. So this is a story from an acquaintance of mine, Cecilia. She actually did a really great talk about this at a conference called Next Level Stalkerware. So Cecilia is a designer in Norway. And in the before times, before the pandemic, when she was still working out of a physical office, she left her office and went to a nearby grocery store and bought some tea that she kept at her office for her to drink at work. Later that night, she got home and her husband was rummaging through the kitchen and he said, "Hey, where's that fancy tea that you bought today?" So it turned out that Tom had downloaded an app for a large Norwegian grocery store, and that because the two have a shared bank account, it was automatically showing him all of her purchases from the grocery store. So this was an issue of assumed consent. The grocery store app was designed to show her grocery store purchases because she had consented to having a bank account with this person, but she had never actually consented to the grocery store app's data and to being part of this app and her data being shared in this way. And her husband wasn't trying to surveil her or get this information in any way. It was just sort of handed to him without him even having to do anything. And people might not think this is such a big deal, like it's just a grocery store. Like, how could that be harmful? I'm sure the developers had those sorts of thoughts. And for Cecilia, it wasn't a big deal. But for people in a domestic violence context, as well as for certain children or teenagers, there are a lot of different potential harms for something like this. An abuser could see sensitive purchases, lots of different things available at grocery stores, such as pregnancy tests, Plan B, the morning after pill. Parents might be able to see children purchasing magazine with LGBT content that they don't approve of. There are lots of different ways that this can cause harm. Cecilia also in her talk gave the example of seeing that your elderly parent is buying a lot of candy and not wanting them to be able to do that, or that they're buying alcohol and pushing back against that. So lots of different issues with privacy could arise from something like this. And it also revealed Cecilia's the time that she had shopped at the grocery store, as well as the location of the grocery store, which gets back to the location data issue. Someone who has recently left their partner and is in an abusive context, that could be very dangerous for them because the abuser could learn their shopping habits and show up at the grocery store when they're trying to avoid them. So thinking about issues with consent, I think that we should borrow standards from anti-sexual assault practices. So thinking about, does your product get authentic consent for user settings, certain features and promotional materials? So for example, opting into sharing your location data, like I was talking about earlier, but even things as little as a checkbox that says that I want to receive emails from this company being checked by default, and sort of saying the user will uncheck it if they don't want it, that is not authentic consent. The person hasn't actually said yes to this. And there are lots of reasons why someone might not see that or might not take the time to uncheck it, and they haven't actually consented to this thing. And especially thinking about, consent being taken away from people in these other ways so much throughout our lives, especially thinking about women, it's important that we're not re-traumatizing people by taking away their consent in these sort of other micro ways and just reproducing these harms in other digital factors. So also thinking about, does your product get consent regularly? Again, going back to the anti-sexual assault practices, we would never say that agreeing to something in the past means that you have now agreed to it in the future. And I think our tech should do the same thing. This is especially important when it comes to things like sharing your location in Google Maps. I've heard from so many people who shared their location with someone like years ago, and don't remember that they've done it. And usually it's funny and it's not dangerous. Like if you lie to your friend, oh, like I'm on my way, and then they're like, no, you're not. I can see you're still at home, and you realize that your location has still been shared with them and you had totally forgotten about it. But in a domestic violence context, again, this can be very dangerous. So I think that with stuff like this, you should be getting consent at different intervals throughout time. And then does your product assume that consent to one product equals consent to another? This is the issue that we saw with Cecilia, where they assumed that because she had consented to share a bank account with her partner, she would consent to being in this grocery store app with him, which of course, back to healthy sex practices, we would never say that consenting to one sex act means you have consented to a different one. And that's something that I definitely think we should be applying with our tech. Okay, so that's the end of the stories. Before I get into integrating designing for safety into your work, I just want to mention briefly this thing called the domestic violence security threat model. So this is the fact that passwords don't keep things private, and owning a device doesn't keep others from using it. Abusers can simply demand passwords using violence or threats of violence. And this is a very different sort of threat model than what typical security professionals are thinking about. They're usually thinking about these sort of anonymous issues, nefarious hackers, preventing data leaks, preventing phishing attempts, and the idea that actually the most dangerous person to a user might be someone who lives with them isn't something that's really considered. But in a domestic violence context, an abuser can simply go into the survivor's phone, like while they're in their shower, while they're sleeping, or just while they're even in the same room, because they can, and do sort of what they want. So this idea that, well, you have a PIN code for your phone, or you have a password for your account, or even that you own a device, doesn't necessarily mean that people are safe from various harms. This comes into play going back to the Google Maps example. You might think like, oh, a user has shared their location with someone. They own their device. There's a password. There's all these things. So they must have consented to doing that. They must have meant to do that. But the domestic violence security threat model teaches us that actually it's not really that straightforward in a domestic violence context. Someone might have shared the location with someone's phone because they have access to that phone, and they've shared their location with themselves. And now that person actually has no idea that this has happened. So this is something that we need to think about as we're designing these features. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about integrating designing for safety into your work. This is a whole chapter in my book, so this is going to be like a very brief overview. So this is the process. It's a summary of all the different things that I've sort of done over the last few years to get at designing for safety. And it includes steps that can basically happen at sort of each different step in the design process. You might notice that this graphic could sort of like fit over the double diamond of the design process. And so it's things that you can do at each point in time. None of these things is especially time consuming. Obviously, if you have a huge product with a ton of features that you want to like retrofit for safety, that's going to be a little bit different and take a lot more time. But for something that is like a new feature that you want to go through this process for, the full thing would be 3 to 4 days. And if it's a small feature, it might be even less than that. And it's just more about taking space to do them. And I mentioned this stuff about time because this is such a common thing that stakeholders or clients or whoever will push back on, like how much is this going to cost basically in time. So being able to kind of look at this and think about like, well, research, we probably only need like 10 hours. These different things will be 2 hours, and being able to give an estimate of it's only going to be like 24 hours and we're going to, split it up over the next month. So it's just going to be like an afternoon, like twice a week. That's going to be a lot easier for a stakeholder to say yes to than something more open-ended. So I have these time estimates there for that reason. So the first step is research into existing news or academic literature about how similar products or features have been weaponized for harm. This is often very straightforward. Like if you're working in the IoT space, there's so much out there. If you are doing something, say with like a feature that involves any type of ability to have some type of message that the other person will see. There's lots of documented issues out there with that. So you can look into existing research. Sometimes there is no existing research and it's a totally novel space, and that's okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that. After you do your research, you create archetypes. So these are kind of like very, very basic personas. It includes an abuser archetype and a survivor archetype. So you would have basically just sort of the person and what their goals are and sort of what the issue is. So for example, you know, if I'm working on a fitness app, I would identify that stalking is an issue with location data being revealed, and I would make my survivor archetype and have it say like this, you know, this person has gotten out of an abusive relationship. Their ex is trying to stalk them. Their goal is to be able to use this app and participate in it fully without having to worry that their ex is going to be able to find them somehow using this app. And then of course the abuser's goal is they want to be able to find their ex on their app, even though their ex is going to have everything set to private. Then there's brainstorming novel abuse cases. So this is where you take some time, and I kind of talk in the book about how to structure this activity, but taking the time to think through what are new areas of harm that haven't been reported on or weren't in the research. If you didn't find any research at all, you would kind of just skip to this step and start with, I like to start with the Black Mirror brainstorm, like thinking about what are the most kind of intense, ridiculous, out of control harms that might happen, and then sort of like rein it into things that are a little more realistic. And this can often be like super fun. I found people really enjoy doing it, and I think that's great. It's okay to have fun during this process. Then there's getting into solutions for preventing the abuser's goals and for meeting the survivor's goals. And then getting into a cycle of testing out those solutions. And as you realize that there are issues, going back, solutioning more, and then testing out those new solutions. So going back to the example of the fitness app, the ex who wanted to stalk his, or the abuser who wanted to stalk his ex, you would set everything on a different account to private, and then see if there's any way that a location data could be found by this person who isn't following the survivor. And this is, again, if the Strava app had done this sort of thing in the first place, they wouldn't have had the sort of little bit of Twitter controversy that they had and the criticism that they got when they were actually revealing location data in a way that was really unclear to the user. And they did fix it, by the way. I'm not trying to just hate on Strava. When they saw that this was a thing and they got called out on Twitter, they fixed it very quickly, which is great. So I really respect that. My thing is sort of like, wouldn't it be wonderful if you had been able to sort of taken the time to identify that this was going to be a problem and had never had to deal with this short amount of bad press. Cool. And so this is the process. Like I said earlier, it's important to not think of this as a sort of like checkbox framework. I really do just want to once again encourage people to like learn more about this stuff, especially whatever the area is that you're working in, to really dig in on that space. I'm not saying people have to become experts or should do that. I don't think people should do what I do and have to spend all their time learning and thinking about this, but you are going to get a lot more out of this process if you sort of have this foundation, this mental model of different ways that interpersonal harm works, especially within the product space that you're working in. Cool, and now we can open it up for questions. I'm going to leave it. I'm just going to share this slide really quick, and then I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll do questions. But thank you all for attending. This is my contact information if you want to get in touch about anything. And my book, again, is called Design for Safety. So cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eva. We have a question from Carl Kaufman. With the number of challenges affecting IT security right now, how do you make sure this privacy issue doesn't fall through the cracks?
Yeah, so I feel like it's a great question. I feel like honestly, this is the role I think designers have to play, and sort of like getting into the security space a little bit, and trying to help people understand that this is an issue. Because like the biggest thing when I sort of like do these talks or talk to people about my book is people just have no idea that this is a thing beforehand. So I think one of the first issues is one of the first things to do is educate people. And if you do have a security team at your company, like talk to them about this stuff. But a lot of people don't, or you might have like a really small client or company or whatever it is, and then it's I think we have to sort of like step up and try to think about some of these security things ourselves.
That's great. Thank you, Eva. And I was hoping, and actually what we can do an open forum and open mic question from the group. If you guys are comfortable opening up your video and mic, we have an open mic question session with Eva.
Yeah, I would definitely love to have like more of a discussion and just Q&A if people are into that.
So if anybody would like to, you all can turn on cameras and mics if you are so inclined. Any other questions for Eva?
Or if anyone has like thoughts or reactions or anything like that, also happy to hear that.
Make sure I did that right.
Hi, Eva. I have one question.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Vibha. Sorry, I won't turn on the camera right now. I am hoping to join as a junior level designer, UX designer in some new position. And this question is a general one. How does one, say, my level of knowledge and experience communicate whatever new ideas that you have just disclosed? And it was mind-blowing, by the way. How does one communicate the importance of what you just said, or what I just learned? Or what makes it easy for someone at a junior level to kind of imbibe this thinking into a larger group, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I get that question a lot. Just even not from junior people, but just people wondering like, how can I like bring this up and have it be taken seriously and not just like shut down? So my answer, I think, kind of applies to people at all levels, and that is to like find allies on your team before you approach your stakeholder, whoever it is you're trying to convince. That's like the big decision maker. Because if you have one, or ideally like more than one other person, but at least one other person who like feels the same way that you do, that you've already talked to them about it, and then once you bring it up, they can immediately be like, yeah, actually, I agree with Vibha, we need to be doing this. I think it's really important. That's going to be a lot more helpful than trying to go it alone. And also just like for solidarity, for support, because anytime you try to, shake things up, especially if it's going to like cost more money in the time that you're going to take to do this, depending on the company, there's going to be some pushback about that. And it's a very uncomfortable topic. A lot of people just like honestly don't want to engage with it because it's very dark and it's not like fun to think about. So having like at least one ally at work for when that happens, to sort of be able to get support from and like be in solidarity with when things get hard is really important. But also it's going to help you like surface these ideas and get people to say yes to them, to doing this work.
Thank you. Sounds great.
Hey, Eva,
Thanks
we
for
have
the
a question.
Yeah.
Alicia in chat. Thank you so much for your talk. Really interesting and important topic. One more question I had is, how do you recommend finding a balance between safety precautions for children using technology versus surveillance extremes, like the scenario you described earlier?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like there's probably no perfect answer to this. Like, what is the balance? I'm not sure if you're asking as like a parent, but yeah, I've like talked to a lot of different parents about this and like how they approach this. And it is really, really tricky because there is like, I mean, I want to acknowledge like there's so much bad stuff out there. I understand like the need to protect like our kids from it. But I think like never doing it secretly, that's sort of, I mean, I think it's going to be different for every family and every relationship. There's like context is really important. But I feel like the sort of line in the sand that I draw is it being secret. And I talk more about this in my book. Like I have a whole section about this, like sort of getting at this question, but like I think there are like some very, very few scenarios where it is ethical to secretly surveil like a child or teenager if you know think like that they might hurt themselves or someone else, like extreme drug use, there's some sort of different things, but other than that, I feel like it has to be part of like an open conversation. And if you do choose to use child monitoring software, that it's something that you're talking to your child about, and that some teenagers that I've talked to about this have said like, well, my mom can track me, but I can also track her. So if there's things like, a lot of those really are more designed for like families to always see, like you want to see where your kid is, but maybe your kid also, they can always see where you are. And some teenagers feel like that makes it feel a little more equal, as opposed to just going like one way. So I think that can be a really good thing. But yeah, and there's like, sorry, I could go on, talk about this forever. There's so much research out there about how like over surveillance impacts teenagers, and how like teenagers are so savvy. They're always going to be savvier than their parents. And, the sort of the first time that you reveal that you know something that like you shouldn't, because you've been watching their phone or whatever it is, they're going to quickly realize what's going on, and they're going to stop. They're going to like find ways around it. Like, there's all these like TikToks from teenagers about like how to get around these different apps and things. And a lot of them are just like straight up leave your phone in your locker at school if you're going somewhere after school. And then that ultimately just makes them like less safe. So I think like, if the goal is safety, it needs to be part of an open conversation, I guess is my thought.
And those of us with older parents end up encountering some of the same questions and the same discussions with siblings around how are we caring for our older parents and very similar things. So yeah.
That's really interesting. I haven't come across that.
Yeah.
Like wanting to see the location of the older parent.
Yeah.
To make sure, right? Yeah.
I have some friends whose they have an older parent, and they're actively surveilling the cameras, the whole bit for safety. But it's interesting. There's all kinds of different contexts where I think some of these questions are worth discussing and thinking about. Where are those?
Yeah.
Lines,
Right. Yeah. And the context is so important. Like lots of things are fine in some relationships that are like abusive in others. So I'm not saying that like this is always abusive all the time. Like context definitely matters, but yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for bringing that up.
I actually had another question. Thank you so much for your first answer and also for this talk. It was super interesting. One question I had was when you talked about reprompting people about consent and location data and information like that. How do you figure out like what level of frequency is appropriate versus like bombarding them constantly with, because like, for example, like when you go onto websites, they ask you about like your cookies and your privacy. And on some websites that becomes so frequent, that's really irritating. So how do you find that balance between making sure that you're asking regularly enough, but not bombarding them constantly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking me that. I feel like it really depends on the product. So like with Google Maps, I can at least spell out like what I would have them ideally do. So like the issue, so so first of all, thinking about the security, the domestic violence security threat model, and the Google Maps example that I shared, like I take my husband's phone, I go into it, I share the location with myself, and he doesn't know that this has happened. Google has something where they send an email every 30 days summarizing who you're sharing your location with, but from what I can tell, it's only sent to certain users. And I think it might be like more, it's like a more recent thing. So people who have shared their location like 5 years ago with someone, they're not going to get this. Or I know that they're like definitely not, I don't know like where the cutoff is. So that's sort of like their like solution, I guess. I would love to see something happen like within like maybe like half an hour later, like, hey, you shared your location with this person half an hour ago, to sort of get at the security threat model with domestic violence, so that, you know, someone did this secretly, you would then be alerted to it. And then with the Google Maps thing, I think I would love to see something like every few days, there's like a reminder, like, do you still want to be sharing your location with this person? And maybe there's something where like, after you've done that, after you've said yes, like 5 times in a row, it says it's gonna like, it like decreases the frequency, because then we could be assured that like, okay, at least one of these times it must have been the actual user of this phone who saw this alert, because we can't always know that it wasn't the abuser who had the phone who said like, who accepted that notification and said yes and agreed to it. But if we've done it like 5 times, you know, every 3 days, we can probably feel good that the survivor has like been alerted to this, and we can decrease it after that. So that's what I would do with the Google Maps situation. But it's different for different products, like the AirTags. If people saw that like a month or 2 ago, like the Tile thing that Apple made, like it's like a little device that you can like stick in your backpack and then track it. And if your backpack gets lost, like, you know where your backpack is. And they kind of consider domestic violence stuff, but not really. They were considering more like anonymous stalkers who are like dropping it into your purse while you're at a coffee shop or something like that. And their solution was like, after 3 days, it'll chirp at you. And again, I was like, that doesn't consider like domestic violence, because like when you come home and it's in your backpack or whatever, and it syncs with the abuser's phone, that 3-day window resets. So like with that, I was like, why does it like 3 days is so long? Like, why can't it just be like once every 24 hours? So it totally depends on the device and the product and whatever. But yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm just like rambling now, but I hope those 2 examples were useful.
No, that's definitely super useful. And with the first example, when you were talking about getting a notification like 30 minutes after, did you suggest 30 minutes because if it was immediate, the like abuser could potentially still have the phone?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Like so many of these products will have like Apple, I think it's Apple Maps has a thing where like, if you want to track, they use the example of your kid, like the kid gets an alert like right away that says like, hey, your location, or it's you set it up so that whenever they like get to their school, you're going to see that they got to their school okay, and they get an alert. And you know, you can't do anything about it except say okay, so it's just alerting you, you can't like opt out or anything. But I'm like, that's not enough, because what if, you know, you're actually doing this to your wife, but you have her phone in that moment, you're just going to accept the notification. So yes, basically, yeah, like half an hour later, in case they have the phone and they've just accepted the immediate thing that comes.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions, thoughts for Eva?
Yeah, just another thought following all this discussion. As I gather, other than location services and obvious domestic violence and those kinds of social issues, can a company be losing out if it didn't actually track or, you know, get information about the users? I'm not kind of educated on that particular topic, but why do people do this? I mean, why is it necessary? Yes, they are offering services like, say, you lose your backpack or luggage and you can track it. But other than that, are the companies who are not providing these kinds of services, are they losing out some way for you?
Sorry, I don't totally understand your question. Are they losing out if they like don't do things like track a location, or?
Yeah.
So like if a
Yeah, that-
company chooses to like do the thing that's safe, sorry, maybe you could just rephrase your question a little bit.
No, I'm sorry
Sorry.
about that. No. What I tried to, I mean, maybe it's just like a little bit of a ramble actually, but it was a thought that why are people doing this in the first place? So there's got to be some kind of a perceived benefit either to the company or it's advertised as a benefit to the consumer, right?
Yeah,
So from one
I see
way or
what
the
you're saying.
other, so if they, on the one hand, they can publish the fact that, yeah, we are super safe and these are the measures we have taken so that we won't, track you or whatever, or else they just keep quiet about it, but they still, spend the money and take care to do those things, but they don't really get anything out of it. So where's that fine line a company needs to draw there?
Yeah, okay. I think I understand your question now. Thank you. So I feel like a lot of people legitimately don't know about this type of thing. Like it's a very new topic, and that's the feedback that I constantly get is like, I had no idea about this, like I was never taught about this. So I think that's a big thing, is just like educating people that this is a problem. And then there's like actually convincing them to like fix the issue is a really big challenge. Am I understanding your question correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think first of all, it's that they don't know. I think like, with the AirTags example, like they were very much aware, like Apple was very much aware that stalking was an issue that they needed to think about. But they weren't thinking about the domestic violence side of things. And I feel like it's such a like when a lot of people, especially like, I don't know, the sort of like stereotypical like old white guy who doesn't know much about like feminism or different things thinks about rape, it's very much like, oh, it's the stranger coming out of the bushes, which, we know that that's not actually true. It's like very uncommon that that's how rape happens. It's, someone that you know and trust, to not do that, who you've like gone to a party with or have let into your home or whatever because they're your friend. And it's the same sort of thing with domestic violence and stalking. It's like actually stalking is usually done by someone that you do know, who might have access to your devices. But people like think about these things or a lot of times people think about these things in very like old fashioned ways or in very like reductive ways where they're not like really understanding the full problem. So even where like with Apple, they're like making attempts to get it right, they still just get it like super wrong. And I think, and a big part of that is because they're not actually listening to like the experts, domestic violence advocates and survivors who could inform them about this type of stuff, which kind of gets back to like the education issue. So it's like educating people, but also people have to like want to take the time to get educated on this. And a lot of people aren't interested in that. So I think there's a lot of different things going on.
Right. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And another really good argument for more diverse teams too.
Absolutely.
I think if there aren't any more questions, I think that might be a really good point to wrap up this evening's. But thank you so much. This was a really interesting talk and conversation. Really appreciate you joining us, Eva.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much. Oh,
I did have one question, if that's okay.
Oh,
Sorry
Go
to
ahead.
just go.
Sure, absolutely.
So what would you suggest to do, like if during your user research process, you aren't coming up with, examples or documented issues for the industry that you're working in?
Yeah, I would just skip ahead to the brainstorming part where you brainstorm the novel abuse cases, like the brand new stuff that's not in any type of research or hasn't been documented at all, and just start there and try to kind of come up with the different issues yourself.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. If anyone has like other questions or wants to connect, my contact info was shared. So definitely don't be a stranger. And thanks so much for having me.
So So this session has been recorded. It will be posted up to our YouTube channel when it's available. Next month, our meetup is going to feature Dr. Rosanna Maria Barbu, who will be sharing a novel heuristic evaluation that focuses on the ability for an application to lead meaningful and positive behavioral change. So that should be a really interesting talk as well. If any of you are interested in giving a talk here for NoVA UX, organizing a panel discussion, running a workshop, please reach out to one of us. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Have a fantastic rest of your evening.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Eva.
Thank you, Eva.